Growing up, Milo and his family always struggled to make ends meet. On the other hand, Audrey was never concerned about where her money was going or even where it was coming from. And so, when unfortunately for their children, they realized that their marriage wasn't going to work out, Milo suddenly found himself without much money again. And so when it came time to stand before a judge, Milo felt he was well equipped with his diligent research on the internet and whatever phone calls he made to professionals. And so he looked to the other side of the courtroom and he saw his ex-wife, but she wasn't sitting alone. She had an attorney. And so he looked over to his own side and he saw, reminding himself that his seat was still empty. Milo had no attorney. And so that case went as well as you'd think it'd go. The judge handed down his verdict, and it was a raw deal. Audrey won legal and physical custody of their children, while Milo was limited to only limited visitation. Bummer. It's a horrible situation. But situations like this is happening all across the country. Over 36 million parents, tenants, patients, consumers, immigrants, and employees, all making between $0 and $38,000 a year, living under the federal poverty line, experience at least one civil legal problem a year. And these civil legal problems deal with the most basic necessities of human life: healthcare, housing, and just maintaining their own income. And so, despite how substantially these issues affect how these Americans can live their lives, for some reason they still won't seek legal help. So who's at fault? This thing called the justice gap. Now, the justice gap is the difference between the civil legal needs of low-income Americans and the resources that are available to meet those needs. Now, this disparity is caused by the high cost to access professional legal services, and that high cost, in turn, is caused by the low supply of attorneys who are willing to work with a lower salary in order to work at a legal aid organization. And those low salaries, in turn, is caused by the lack of funding that legal aid organizations receive. And in California specifically, one of the main causes for the persistence of this justice gap is something called the knowledge gap. Now, this knowledge gap is characterized by Californians who don't even know that there's a legal component to what they think is a personal problem. It's also characterized by Californians who choose to deal with their issue independently, who are too worried about how much it's going to cost, and who are too afraid to take it to the courtroom. And so now that we've briefly discussed what the main causes of this justice gap are, what are some of its effects? Well, thinking back to Milo's situation, we can see that low-income Americans are forced into the deep end in court cases, dealing with their own basic necessities in civil cases. And because of this, they are skewed to lose their cases. They are slated to lose. And in the process of losing, they lose their families, their job, their homes, and whatever money they may have left. So what's being done? In California alone, legal aid organizations already receive $220 million a year. But that $220 million still isn't enough for them to function properly, serving the people who need their services the most. And in Washington State, public officials have instituted a program called the Legal Technician Program. With this program, they have started a new position called the legal technician, which aims to remedy the low supply of attorneys who are willing to work for with that low salary. But it still has its downsides though, as these legal technicians are only allowed to work with family matters cases and can't represent officially in court. So seeing that $220 million in funding a year isn't enough to fix this justice gap, what can a high schooler even do? Well, looking over the causes of the persistence of this justice gap, sure, $220 million is a lot of money, and that's aiming to fix the gap in resources. But that gap in resources isn't the only reason for the persistence of this justice gap. Remember the knowledge gap? I started the American Justice Club with the hope and goal of bringing students together who are passionate about important social issues, and especially about incorporating the youth into finding those solutions and executing those solutions. With the justice gap in mind specifically, my group, the American Justice Club, our guest speakers, our civic projects, our volunteer work, and cooperation with local bar associations, we work to educate other students about how the civil legal system works, what their civil rights are, and where to find resources, hopefully preparing them for the day after they receive their diploma. So, even though I may not have $220 million sitting in my back pocket to donate to legal aid organizations, preventing this and closing this justice gap starts with us. We can educate ourselves and educate others on how to be prepared for when they experience a civil legal issue that's very, very real. And through this, we may even inspire the next generation of lawyers, of legal aid attorneys, of judges, of public defenders, the change makers who will bridge the disparity between Americans and justice and finally close this justice gap. Thank you.